and I'm ready to rock it. So here's what we're going to be doing. Let me introduce myself. That's how we start. I am Rashad. I've been in, God, how long have I been in industry for now? It's over 6 years. I've worked in fintech. I've worked in healthcare. I've worked at startups, and I've built large-scale systems and all that stuff. But more recently, I've been incredibly enamored by the pace at which AI is progressing. So that's kind of what I want to talk about in these live streams. Every morning, keep me accountable. If I don't show up, shoot me a DM, ask me where I am, ask me what's up. Anyway, let's dive right into it. Enough of this fluffer material. So there's one thing that's been top of my mind for this week, really, and that has been the almost flip-flopping of US's global AI policy. I mean, originally, I feel like the US was very protectionist with its AI policies, right? It was America first. We're going to develop our technologies. We're going to keep all of our hardware and the chips to ourselves, and we're going to hamstring China, basically the other superpower that's in contention for the heavyweight title champion, heavyweight championship title is China. That's the only other superpower that's got a bib in this race. And we were all about hamstringing China, but that very recently changed. And the reason it changed, I think, is it heralds a pretty important strategic shift in the US's approach to how it plans to be an AI player. And I think, this is my opinion, I think this is the right way forward, right? So in the beginning of 2025, the US was very protectionist, but then to the point that we were having export controls on NVIDIA chips going into China. The H20 chips, which are great for inference, the Blackwell chips were pretty much banned in terms of making their way over to China. That has since changed. I don't know what kind of relationship Jensen Huang has with the president right now, but the president seems pretty impressed with the guy, and Jensen Huang has been able to convince the president that it is in the US's best interests for it to be selling chips to China, the only other superpower that's got a solid bib in this race. Well, I truly think that Jensen isn't really just trying to sell chips. I mean, obviously, like if anybody stands to benefit from this, it's going to be NVIDIA first and then the rest of America. But I do think that it actually makes strategic sense for the US to be allowing their hardware to build AI systems around the world, right? Before we go into talking about how DeepSeek was such a monumental leap and the reasons it actually failed in the adoption stage, let me talk about I think there's really no way to get around, there's really no way to skip talking about the specific kinds of chips that NVIDIA makes. I mean, all of this material is kind of a pish-posh of a lot of different topics, and I find myself a little, flat on my face as I get into these things. Sip of the Bengal spice to get my focus back on. Anyway, let's talk about the chip that's been at the forefront of the export control, namely the H20 chips. So the H20 chips are great for one thing and one thing only. In fact, they are less complex. They are, I want to say, less expensive than the H100 chips, which are more powerful, but the H20 chips do one thing extremely well, and that is inference. There's a lot of cost that goes into training AI models, but there's the upfront cost, which goes into developing the AI models, and that is to give the training process, the compute and memory needed to build these amazingly large AI models. And then there's the phase that comes after, which is people using these incredibly large AI models, which, by the way, also has an incredibly high energy footprint, and that is the inference. So to summarize, the training uses a lot of energy, but that is all done by these big companies, and like outside influence doesn't really have a lot to do with that energy bill. It's mostly these companies developing frontier models that foot most of that energy bill. And then there is the cost of inference, which is passed on to the people who are the users of these AI models. Like when you pay for the subscription for your OpenAIs or your Perplexities and whatnot, you are paying them a subscription premium in order to be using these models for inference. The H20 chips are incredibly good at inference. And the reason this ties in is because the US temporarily had a limit to the number of H20 chips that could be exported into China. Since then, um, that restriction has been reversed, courtesy of Jensen Huang's sway in the Senate, and because of how close of an ear he has with the president. But anyway, this isn't to say that this policy or this shift in approach is unanimously accepted by everybody in Congress and Senate. There's plenty of politicians who are very against this change in posturing, and for good reason, right? I mean, like AI, the U.S. giving access to its top technology, um, in terms of the most effective hardware that exists on the planet, and giving that access to its most competent rival, is in a lot of ways a pretty risky move, right? But anyway, that policy has been reversed. H20s are now open to be exported to China, which is incredible news for NVIDIA. However, the more advanced chips cannot be exported, and that's probably still for the best, right? This does mean that if the H20s are being used for training purposes or inference purposes, or basically developing AI that the US is not on board with, they can pull the plug on exporting these chips at any time. But that being said, I would want to say that the Chinese market historically has been pretty obscure in terms of kind of pulling the hood and seeing what's going on, under the hood. TBD on how well the US is able to monitor whatever China is doing with these H20 chips. Anyway, I think overall this is great, and the reason for that is if the export control was still in full effect, that would have forced China to rely on Huawei chips. That would have forced Huawei to step onto the podium, shine up to the moment with all the limelight on it and all the money that would be making its way from the Chinese government and Chinese investors in order to come up with a chip that competes with NVIDIA chips. Obviously, that's still going to happen. You know, China isn't an idiot. It fully is aware that it's not an ideal situation to be in, where the US can pretty much just play with the lever of how much AI hardware is available to China for developing its models. But the bottom line is, it was a pretty strategic play by the US to allow these H20 chips to go into China, because now Chinese AI development, to a large extent, is going to be reliant on US export of hardware. So here's the AI stack, right? At the base you have AI hardware. NVIDIA has total dominance on it. But even underneath the base of, let's call them, obviously not consumer grade, but enterprise grade hardware, NVIDIA has complete dominance over that stack at this point. And underneath that stack, you have the foundries, the chip makers, right? You have TSMC and to some extent Samsung. But at the end of the day, the focus and the limelight right now is on the enterprise grade hardware producers, NVIDIA. If all of the AI development that is happening around the world is built on top of NVIDIA's hardware, that gives the US a lot of sway in where this AI race is going, in the global policy play that's happening around AI. Let's sort of wind the clock back to a scare that kind of had not just the US, but most US companies shivering in their jeggings. So DeepSeek came out at the beginning of this year, and they proved a very scary point to US tech at a time when investors were dumping billions of dollars into AI hardware companies and billions of dollars into building these foundation models, these frontier models by OpenAI, Meta, Microsoft, and all these other big tech juggernauts. DeepSeek came out of the blue and basically claimed that, hey, we spent $8 million odd with some pretty low tier legacy NVIDIA chips, and we produced an open source model that not just competes pretty well with your frontier models, but even outperforms them in a lot of ways. And that was a red alert across the halls of all of these AI juggernauts, right? I mean, NVIDIA obviously was shaking in its boots because, you know, like if you can prove that you can make a pretty competitive frontier model without using its latest chips, that's not going to bode well for its future revenue. Anyway, here's the reason that DeepSeek didn't catch on. Here's the reason that people just, you know, like made a bunch of videos, experimented with DeepSeek on their local machines, or, you know, used the APIs and then basically moved on from DeepSeek. And that was because China, or whatever hedge fund was responsible for making DeepSeek, didn't figure out the infrastructure needed for inference. Inference actually uses more energy than the training process itself, and you need some pretty effective AI chips in order to make inference work effectively. Which is why I really think that the removal of the export control on the H20 chips is potentially going to revive DeepSeek and its sort of nascent or lackluster adoption that we've seen in the beginning of this year. So a lot to see about where DeepSeek goes with the removal of this export control, right? The thing to remember about DeepSeek is it actually used some pretty novel technologies under the hoods to make sure that even with the limited GPUs that it had available, it was doing a pretty bang-ass job. For example, it used memory compression, and it learned how to use these GPUs, which were legacy GPUs, more efficiently. So it was able to produce a lot better results given limited hardware and limited compute and memory. Okay, what does all of this mean? Right? I think the other thing to point out about the US's change in posturing when it comes to AI global policy is that the US does it is pushing to make development of AI models open source. Open source is a term that is misinterpreted quite a bit outside of the tech world. For example, when people hear open source, DeepSeek, for example, was an open source model. When people heard DeepSeek was free or open source, they just assumed that it was going to be free for anybody to use. No, DeepSeek being an open source model basically meant that anybody could house this model, take this gigantic model, host it on any server, and use it without paying license fees of any kind. Does that mean it's free? Absolutely not. You still have to pay the tremendous cloud bills that you're going to need to host those servers, to run inference, and all of those costs are going to have to be borne by you, right? That is not to underplay the value of open source. Open source is still pretty amazing, right? But there's sort of two things that you have to keep in mind when you're talking about open source AI models. Number one, the architecture is open source, right? You get the base model without the weights. And then there's the other layer, which is the weights. I think there were some models that Facebook went open source with in the beginning that were just the model architecture was open source, but not so much the weights, which obviously doesn't let you take advantage of the many hundreds of thousands of GPU usage, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of GPU training effort that was put into coming up with those model weights, right? Anyway, I think this policy change of the US government to develop open source models is a way for the US to exert soft influence across other countries. Because let's face it, developing these frontier models is no easy task, right? A random company can't come in and develop their frontier model. The closest a company did to coming up with that was DeepSeek, and that was by a hedge fund, and they just dropped $8 million, about $8 million into the process. You can't just have a random company come in and present a frontier model, because you need to be investing hundreds of thousands of dollars into getting top-of-the-line hardware to train these AI models on. And then you need access to tremendous amounts of data, the likes of which are probably accessible to companies like Google and Meta, because they're sitting on all of our data. They have tons and tons of data that they're sitting on that they can use to train their AI models. And then lastly, even when you want to set up an infrastructure that makes all of these great large AI models usable, that takes a lot of GPU usage and a lot of money as well. So for any small company to come in, let alone any random country to stand up a frontier AI model, is going to be incredibly hard. So the US and China, to be honest, kind of has a monopoly on shipping AI models, and this gives them that ability to exert soft influence, particularly when they're training their models and when they're presenting open source versions of their AI models that come, with these weights available. They're going to train these AI models with US values on what's considered insensitive, US values on what's considered even politically correct, US values on what's considered morally right versus morally wrong. Like when you, for example, ask ChatGPT about any moral dilemma, the kind of responses you're going to get back is going to be leaning heavily on a westernized version of morality. And also, I'm sure there's going to be cultural underpinnings to all kinds of answers you seek from these US developed AI models. And when you ship these models to other parts of the world, Western values, Western moralities, and Western cultures are going to be shipped to these other countries. And this is because these countries can't afford to stand up these AI models on their own. This is absolutely a way to exert soft influence over the rest of the world. And I think this is actually strategically incredibly smart on behalf of the US. Previously, I think other tools of propaganda, for lack of a better word, were more tangible, right? You had Sesame Street being viewed across TVs everywhere, all around the world, and that was a way of exporting uh, Western values around the world via media. But right now, AI is going to be the next frontier to be doing that. And I think this, to be honest, this kind of justifies the loosening of the export control around the H20 chips and the NVIDIA chips, and also this explains the push that the U.S. government is making on its AI policy to make its AI policy more open borders, more open weights, right? More open source. All right, that's all the ranting I had for this morning. I will see you again tomorrow. Thanks for tuning in.